Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 80 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm back here with Curt and Jerry, and we are this is part two of structuring a trauma-informed transformational process. We had so much great discussion on the training aspect of this, the starting point. Jerry's words with me, the why we're doing this, we're going to make this made into a two-part episode. So we're going to talk today about a little bit about the policy review part of this, where, some of the real hard but meaningful work gets done, and a little bit of implementation, how to maybe create a team to work on this. So getting down to some of the real structural parts of this today. So to start out, we're going to do a shared bright, shiny object of the week, because it's been, I know for myself, a really difficult week here in Colorado. For those I know, I can turn on CNN and not see what's happening in our state even on. So I'm not sure all of our listeners are aware. But this is on April 20th. It's the 20th anniversary, am I correct, of the Columbine shooting, which I think for both the trauma movement, for how education looks at safety, and I think just for all of us in this field was a really critical and powerful event, and still in Colorado is in our psyche in a way, as well as the unfortunate Aurora theater shootings and other tragedies that have hit our state. And we had a young lady from Florida who sounds like on social media was really idolizing the shooters in Columbine, and flew into our state. I have to breathe here because it's hard for me to say this next thing. Was able to take an Uber to a gun store as a, I think, 18, 19-year-old and buy a powerful, high-powered rifle just several blocks from Columbine. Luckily, for whatever reason, we're still getting information on it. She decided to go up to the mountains. I thought about you, Jerry, because the foothills of Jefferson County is not a small area if you're not from Colorado. And I know, Jerry, you kind of live around that area at least, and so many of our friends, families live in that area. And so she was in this big geographic area and then was found yesterday. We're recording this on the 18th. She had committed suicide. Just tragedy after tragedy. And I think for us, or at least for me, even though I wasn't in the state, I moved here shortly after the Columbine tragedy. I felt stirred up. And if you didn't see the news, I know my wife didn't go to school yesterday. So this threat, and to me, the frustrating part, the ability of somebody with probably some obvious mental illness stuff going on, was able to get off a plane, buy a high-powered rifle, and I think I heard that 500,000 kids in the Denver metro area didn't go to school yesterday, which I totally support that decision, but I just think it kind of shows the power of this. So I just wanted to give, I know I've got such mixed feelings, from anger to sadness, to just thinking about everybody who'd been through the Columbine shootings here locally and nationally, what's happened. And I just want to give each of you a chance, because I kind of need you both today as well to help me process this and try to find some meaning, if there is, in any of this thing. So Jerry, you always bring things into my consciousness that I need. So I just kind of wonder, as you sit back, knowing you were here during those events and were involved in so many ways with the trauma stuff during that time, just kind of as you reflect back on both the anniversary, but also this really tragic event that happened in our state. And just, I'd love to get your thoughts.
So, I think the issue for when we look back at Columbine is that all of us were having to take care of people while we were also being impacted by the trauma. As a first responder to the event, and also I live a mile from Columbine, and my son's friends were actually in the school, and my son, the Columbine kids actually moved over to my son's high school at the time to finish school. Certainly was impacting. So, as a caregiver, you not only have to figure out how to manage your own feelings, but also and cope with them at the same time as managing your children's feelings. Mm-hmm. And I think that, an event like yesterday activates all that for all those memories, along with the current stress. So it's hard to differentiate what is the current level of stress and threat, and what is your, in some ways, traumatic reaction to that piece. So I think that, the decisions that were made with safety in mind, physical safety. But we know that trauma is way more than just physical safety. It's about psychological safety. And that today, following it, you have a reaction from feeling really positive about the decisions that were made to anger and rage at the district for overreacting, or anger and rage at issues about buying a gun, and gun control issues, issues around, how sad it is that an 18-year-old took her life, and thinking about the family of that 18-year-old, is that we have to both feel and we have to deal. We have to be able to cope with it. In some ways, teachers have to go back to school today, have to be with kids. Parents have to be with their children and talk about these issues. So I think it's these kinds of times we spend a lot of time talking to people about the decisions we made, like closing school for 500,000 kids. But we spend very little time talking to parents about how they should talk to their children about this stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think that, really being able to give kids the information they need, but then really being quiet to listening to their reaction and helping them to hold their feelings and to cope with their feelings about this, is both the important piece. So my heart goes out to the family of this young lady. And it also goes out to us as a society of trying to struggle with these issues of how do we protect people's rights at the same time of how do we take care of ourselves and keep ourselves safe. Yeah. It's a tough dilemma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Curt, what are your thoughts on this?
The biggest question I heard was, how do I talk to my kids about this? That was a confusing thing for a lot of parents. How do I think, Jerry, you said it well. How do I help them to have enough information and be honest with them? But also that's going to generate some feelings of potentially unsafe feelings for those children. And how do I, as a parent, manage both my feelings about it and their feelings of feeling unsafe? I was reminded and referred quite a few people to Dan Siegel's Whole Brain Child. The great sequence of, how do you talk to a child about something bad that happened to them or that could happen to them? And there's a couple of things that jump out at me as some real key components of that strategy, is to remind them of the present event and that they were there and I was there too, and I was with you and we ended up safe. And that the reaction to this was to maintain safety. And so you can come out of that with the memory of it then when you recall it later, is that I ended up safe, not that I ended up harmed. And so I thought that I thought of that book a lot yesterday while I was getting lots of questions about that from people around. Yeah, that's kind of what I thought, and I think that I had, listening to this woman who traveled here, a couple of thoughts came into my mind is made me more committed to the work that I do.
Mm-hmm.
That it's amazing and quite sad that people get in situations where they feel so much pain that it generates the urge to hurt other people and to hurt ourselves. And that's a part of our physical makeup. And so the fact that people feel that kind of pain just kind of redoubled my commitment to what I do for a living and how important that is. Those are a couple of thoughts that I had yesterday for sure, and kind of came out of it like, okay, I'm doing the right thing and I'm going to keep doing it, and I'm going to keep doing it as the best that I possibly can.
Yeah. And again, we don't know. And I'm really cautious when you don't know much of the story, because I think that was some of the, the scary stuff yesterday is, who is this? Where are they? And that uncertainty, I think was incredibly powerful. I mean, I went out, not in the foothills of Jefferson County, just to coffee. And there was just this thought is, what if she's there? And that's totally, in many ways, illogical. Like there's no, she's probably not going to go to Old Town Arvada. She's from Florida. She probably doesn't even know where that is, but at the same time, it just reminds me how lucky I am and how privileged in so many ways I am, is that I don't have to fear for my safety or the safety of my wife many, many days out of the year. I mean, we might get cut off in traffic or something like that. Also, I know for so many of the kids and families I've worked with that live in dangerous neighborhoods, walking out their door felt like I felt, and probably even more real than what it was. So, again, there's so many variables. And I think, Jerry, again, thanks for your words of wisdom, and you too, Curt, is that, there seems to be variables we could control in this situation. Again, not knowing, maybe she could have got mental health services in school. That's all an unknown, but it just tears me up that somebody on the FBI watch who was watching could get off in our state and buy a high-powered rifle so close to Columbine. I hope that makes us think. I'm not sure we will, but I hope that makes us think. So, any final words before we move on? All right. I think that's good. And again, if anybody else, our listeners, have thoughts, please throw them in the comments section too, because I think we're all reacting to this. As sometimes you're the trauma expert, sometimes you're an emotional train wreck. And I just want to wish all the teachers, the students of Columbine, but also just Colorado this week, our best, because I know it's not just that school. It's the statement or the slogan that resonated with me as soon as I moved to the state is "We are Columbine," and I think that's as true today as it was 20 years ago. So let's transition into our topic. So just a review of last time. We're really talking about, and this again, as we talked about last time, looks different for every organization. So, but trying to kind of put at least a skeleton forth about how an organization or a program might look at their trauma-informed journey. I like the trauma-informed transformational process. And so we talked a lot about training, which is obviously the knowledge acquisition of this journey, and also maybe looking at some assessments and other things we could do to create a starting point. And so at this point of the journey, when I work with people, it comes time to kind of do some of the real tangible work. And not that the things up to this point aren't tangible, but how do we start to kind of put the trauma-informed lens on what we are currently doing? And for a lot of the trauma literature and a lot of the processes you see out there, that involves kind of a policy procedure kind of review. And otherwise, you look at your operations under that lens. And one of those things, and I just kind of like to get your guys' thoughts on this in your work, because one of the things that I see, especially for larger organizations or even larger programs, is sort of a creation of what I like to call a trauma transformation team, and a group of people who are given some capacity to really take a look at the policies and procedures of what's going on. And I think we throw out that review, and it can seem like a very simple thing, but it can often take many years to go through this. If you look at your HR policies, you look at your programmatic policies, if you've got multiple programs you're looking at. And for people that are approaching this, again, building on the training, the starting point that we talked about last time, I just kind of wonder when you work with people that are ready to start really looking at what they're doing under the trauma-informed lens, I just kind of wonder what suggestions, ideas, or guidance that you can give our folks or that you give folks that you work with about this really important part of the process.
You're talking about the process of changing policies and procedures at the organizational level?
Yeah, well, or the program level, depending on who's looking at it. But I would say kind of both, because I think I kind of put policies, procedure, and approaches in there as well, because we do things that might not be written down necessarily in policy either.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I guess when I do this, one of the first things I do is that team has to go back and really look at their mission, right, and their vision, and one is that still reflect what you think is the organization's mission. Mm-hmm. So as we begin to look at this vision and mission, then I bring in someone like Curt and I say, let's talk about how that we can operationalize that, right? What does that look like, right? Is that there are people on your team that then you say is, what does that look like? And then when we go through, what are the principles we believe in that are going to drive that? So you can use things like SAMHSA's principles of issues of safety, issues of empowerment, issues of how we collaborate. How do we involve our peers and consumers in our decision-making process? How do we look at the issue of cultural and historical trauma? That's just one model. Or you can look at the sanctuary commitments to kind of, whatever your structure is, there's some principles that drive this process that I think that there has to be some shared agreement and understanding of what that means. So there's some work to do before you actually pick up the policies and principles, right? And then when we go through those, I think the decision has to be made really is, what are the policies? And I think, Matt, going back to the last one, is what do we want to start?
Yeah.
What do we want to stop? And what do we want to continue? Mm-hmm. Right? So as we look at these kind of rules and structures and processes we've created over time, under this new lens, we begin to go through these processes. So things like hiring practices. Are we looking at the issue of diversity? Are we looking at equality? Equity? Are we looking at the population that we serve, and is it represented in there? If it's not, what are the practices we're going to do to bring in people to help us to be more responsive to those types of things? We look at, are we in some ways looking at this issue of safety for our clients, for the families, for the staff, for us as administrators, how we manage and resolve conflicts in our organizations. I mean, so there's a number of issues as we go through these policies and practices that we are each time asking those questions through a trauma-informed lens. Does this support what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah.
And it's not a one-time thing. As Curt knows, is when issues come up, we've got to create a space where our staff can begin to have voice and choice in all of these types of things. So when you're making up those teams, is that team representative of all aspects of your organization? And I would even go to, does it have some representation of the consumers you're serving?
Yeah, absolutely. I think always that question of, do we have the right people on the table, opens that up in a very big way. And I've always just been very impressed of, even when I'm working with 15, 16-year-olds, getting their input, has been such a critical part of this process, because they come from that lived experience of our services, as well as family members as well.
Yes. And when we were at the home, I don't know if you remember, Matt, we created a safety committee.
Yeah.
And the safety,
I may have been running that at the time.
And I think the safety committee was made up of staff and the residents that were in our programs. And we helped define this issue of physical safety and psychological safety. And they were very much, the residents were very informative of what their experience was, in a way that was helpful to us, not only in programming, but also in understanding their experience of being in the program.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's such an important perspective of what it's like to be in the program. The same way, gathering information from the people who work in the organization, if you're in a leadership position, it's a really important perspective to understand what it's like to be employed there. That's invaluable information, I think, when we think about organizational structure and design and program structure and design.
Right.
They're critical pieces of information.
Yeah.
One of the challenges I think I've seen repeated more than I would like to see. I think, Jerry, your experience and my experience at Common Organization, and this has played out in other organizations that I've been involved with as well, is the struggle of trying to get the right levels of the organization involved in the process. It's been a challenge that I've seen play out over and over and over again, that you can get a kind of mid-level of the organization involved, and it can make a difference for everybody that they supervise, but the higher level of the organization is not involved. And that creates a problem when you've got a mid-level involved and a higher level not involved. Even though the higher level may be supportive of it, they're not getting the same information in the same context. And so that can generate some conflict. I haven't seen yet that go really, really well. Just know that I think that that's a kind of a problem that's going to have to be navigated at some point, and probably not be surprised by having to navigate through that as you go through the process.
Yeah. And one of the things that as you're saying that, I've had a similar experience. A lot of times, and I really try to nip this in the bud, because I think it sets up this. One is, you got to have somebody that understands the capacity and resources available. I think if you want to kill a team's morale, have them work on a project, get all excited about a project, and said, oh, we can't do that.
There's no resources.
Nothing will kill a team quicker. Nothing will take a them versus us and go to war within an organization, to have people put their time, energy, and passion into something and then be told it can't happen. So to have that upper level. But I also, like, where I think this really in some ways has a huge impact is when we include people we might not typically think about a trauma-informed process. I think it's got to include HR. Like, even if you're a small organization, I know a lot of organizations like, hey, we don't have an employee assistance program. Well, if you don't have availability to at least affordable, if not free, mental health services for your staff, that's a big part of, in my thinking, the trauma-informed journey. It's, do we pay a livable wage? So to get finance involved. And I think, when we get those individuals involved, we're all doing this. That this is, if we really want to get the trauma thinking and trauma responsiveness into our DNA, it's really trying to put the lens strategically on all aspects of that and having that representation, because I think it's just as powerful for a finance person to go through a programmatic and addressing programmatic issues as it is for the programmatic staff to connect with the finance people on that end as well. So I see some of the powerful changes that people talk to me about years later are not necessarily the programmatic changes, because those I think come pretty clear, even though there's some hard work to be done, don't get me wrong. But those kind of after training become pretty clear. But a lot of people come and said, hey, we looked at our PTO process and we've seen a huge improvement in the health of our staff because we put that lens on those areas as well. So I don't rule out your administrative folks in this too.
So one of the issues I think that these teams have to guard against is that when you bring people from various levels of the organization, they're going to hold different pieces of the issues. So oftentimes the people closest to the child or the family themselves, because safety is such an issue, they may be focused on physical safety.
Mm-hmm.
Why other people seem to be way more focused on psychological safety.
Yeah.
And your HR may come in and say, we're worrying about social safety, right? And I think as a team, instead of getting polarized around one piece of this, the team has to hold all this as a dilemma of how do we bring this. That's what this team does, mm-hmm. In a way. And so really, these are the issues of bringing these lenses. These are the dynamics that get disassociated in your organization. That team has to be the place that we hold all these issues. Mm-hmm. So in a way, everybody has to feel safe enough that their voice is heard, valued, and then it's used as creating an integrated decision-making process. Yeah. As opposed to who's gonna, I either have more power or I don't have power, so I'll say this in this meeting, but I'll go out and do something else. We've got to develop processes here to really sit with and hold this and really reflect on how do we move the organization forward with all these issues.
Well, and why, Curt, I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, is why, and if anybody's interested, I'm actually getting some great feedback on it in my blog, which you can find. If you go to traumainformedlens.org, you can find it. But a lot of times we'll just throw a group of people together and say, do work. And I think sometimes we kill these initiatives before we get started because the team, we just assume that if you stick 10 or 12 people in a room together who don't necessarily have a shared, at least organizational language, they'll figure it out. They'll get to that performing stage, so to speak. And I wonder kind of, Curt, in your thinking is, one of my parts and one of the things I really suggest is just don't throw a group in a room with a policy and say, make this policy trauma informed. If this group is going to be together for a sustained period of time, and if you're going to do a policy review, they're going to be together for a sustained period of time. I would argue that you need to probably spend at least a good amount of time up front bringing that team together as a functional team. Because, again, as I say, you can stick more than 2 people in a room together, maybe even 2 sometimes, and all of our dysfunctions will come to the surface very quickly. So I wonder, Curt, as you I know you work with a lot of, organizational improvement processes throughout your career. How do you think about the health and the productivity of maybe a new team forming around such a difficult initiative like this?
I think one of my favorite activities to do with a team, whether it's a new team or whether it's an existing team, is to have a conversation where we get organized around the question of what are our group norms.
Yeah.
And it's a nice conversation to go through. And even with a team that's already established or is going through some conflict, it's always one that you can kind of throw into let's just have if you're the leader, right, you can always ask a question, and that's kind of nice to have that power as the leader and be able to say, so what are our norms? How do we do this? And it's nice to make those things that, I mean, norms develop whether or not we're explicit about them or not. And so they tend to develop, and having a moment to pause and reflect on what are our actual norms and have those be then made explicit and verbalized. And then the next follow-on question is that how we want it to be? Mm-hmm. We can be intentional about what our norms are. If we don't like the way that this team is operating, we can, as a group, we have the ability to change that. It's not like we're just, riding the pony and you can't steer it. You can. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, an important moment for a team to go through, whether it's brand new and often when it's brand new, it's nice to do that right up the front. Like, what do we want this to look like? How do we want to interact with one another? How do we want to handle conflict? And then if it's a new one, always you're getting conflict generating in a team. If you're doing, a really good job and you have some difficult problems to solve, you are going to have conflict. It's actually a good thing, as long as it's not interpersonal conflict. If it's around how we do things and how we kind of think about things, that can be really positive. And so it's a nice pause activity to go back to with a group and say, how are we dealing with conflict, and what are our norms, and what are we doing right now, and is that what we want it to be? Yeah. That's one of my favorite activities to do, to kind of wade through that, either with new or existing teams.
Yeah. Well, and I think, Jerry, I'd love to get your thoughts, as I know you've sat in probably thousands of meetings throughout your career. I think sometimes we talk about so much about trust and safety and other things when we talk about delivering care to the folks that we're trying to help. But I would argue some teams don't even know why they meet. But if we have this team with purpose, how would you help a group develop trust, safety? What are some of your thinkings about how you bring, the stuff that we talk about kind of every day into a team that's going to do some pretty intensive work, and as Curt said, is going to have some conflict, and how kind of you see the role of trust and safety, and add anything else in there to that making that conflict a creative experience and not something that kind of stops the team in their tracks.
Trust is about, in a way, of us managing what comes up in the room, right? There's the task, but then what you're talking about is all tasks have an interpersonal quality, right? And if you spend all the time on the interpersonal issues, you never get done with your task, and the group feels discouraged and not doing it. If you pay attention to the task and you miss the interpersonal issues, your group's going to not feel safe enough to do the hard work. Mm-hmm. So, the balance of a leader is really balancing this issue of, when do we get task focused and when do we have to stop and look at our process, right? And I think those norms that Curt identified is that when we're some reason we're not abiding by the norms we created, it's usually because there's some affect in the room. Right? I'm feeling so much that I talk over somebody, or I'm feeling so much that I shut down and I don't participate. So as the leader, I have to be able to manage the flow of not just say, how did we do with the norms today? But really, what do you think is getting in the way of us being able to carry out the task? Because I clearly brought you all together because you're capable of carrying out this task, but something's happening in the room that's interfering with that. Mm-hmm. How do we talk about that with enough depth that we could get back to doing the task?
Yeah.
Right? And that's always the goal of talking about the process, not processing it to process it, but processing it so we can get back to the task. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where a good leader keeps in mind that the charge of the group and facilitating the process in the room to have the group be successful.
Yeah.
That's how I see to be honest with you, when I've done that well, it's because I'm present and I'm really in the group. When I've had trouble, it's because something other than the group, outside the group, that worried about this. I got one foot in the group and one foot someplace else.
Yeah.
And so as a leader, I really have to be monitoring my own internal state. Just like a parent, how do I manage be aware of my own state and then aware of the group state and then monitor the shifts moment to moment so I could be present for that.
Yeah. And one interesting strategy that I read about it somewhere. I know this didn't pop into my mind as an original thought, but I came across along the way, which I kind of like. And through my blog post, I'm going to do a whole thing about how to structure a process like this, because I think so much we kind of show up without a really concrete agenda, concrete focus. But I kind of like, as Jerry talks about, I think when the leader is also sometimes facilitating the meeting, it's sort of hard to do that. And I like to throw out this model because I rarely ever see it in action, where you actually have a facilitator who's structuring the meeting, keeping everybody on time, going through the agenda items. And then you sort of have the highest ranked person in the room, which would be the natural kind of at least formal leader in the group, even though that can play out in a lot of different ways. That leader kind of pays attention to the process, because I think those I know for me, it takes a lot to focus on the structure to make sure we get through the agenda and to keep an eye on the process as well. So I just want to throw out, sometimes we think, the highest ranked person has got to be in charge of the agenda, in charge of the facilitation, and then in charge of the process. And there's no there's not an 11th commandment handed down by God that person has to be the same individual. So I think for some of this, and again, making sure you have a structured agenda, a structured process, all that's important. But also sometimes maybe you as a leader are not the best person to facilitate a group, and you can hand that off to somebody else who might be, I know for me, unless I'm working with Jerry, I'm usually not the most detailed person in the room. So a lot of times I'll find a staff with that kind of strength that says, we need to have our agenda set by Tuesday. And if they don't get the agenda set by Tuesday, they won't sleep that night. That's a great person to put in charge of the agenda. Where I like to facilitate the process, maybe I have somebody else can be in tune with how we're doing, and that person can kind of interrupt. So I think sometimes we just show up to meetings and the highest ranked person runs it, and maybe we have an agenda, maybe we don't. So I think whether we're talking about a trauma transformational process, which because of its intensity really requires some forethought, planning, norm construction, safety, and trust, I think sometimes we get stuck in a model of meetings which doesn't necessarily serve us well.
So I want to just address that for a minute, because I think some people go in and just do that. And I think it's the wrong thing to do. And the reason I think it's the wrong thing to do is you haven't stepped back and talked about what's the underlying assumption of that is there's a shared leadership process, right? And that is in some ways a norm of the group, right? Is that in the beginning when Curt talked about the norms, is how do we see leadership in this group? Right? So if you have this norm of saying, we have shared leadership, but I'm going to come in and be the leader, I'm going to be the facilitator, I'm going to be, then the nonverbal is, we don't really have shared leadership, right? So I would start with some of those basic assumptions and the norms. And then when we kind of get to what is shared leadership, then your model really makes sense, right? But if we as a group in some way struggle with that as a process, when I've assigned people to do something, but I've somehow stayed in power and did it, it really didn't work very well. Right? So I really like what you're because it matches my way of doing it, but it has to go back to those basic assumptions and norms of the group process itself.
Yeah.
That shared leadership is that's a challenge, right? Because it's great in concept, and we get a lot more creativity in that kind of an environment. But it requires a really highly functioning group of people to do that. Mm-hmm. And that requires a lot of effort to maintain and create that kind of a thing. That requires some really specific verbalizations of how do we do this and how do we think about it. Because that's a higher level of group skill collectively. And you don't just walk into that and go, okay, we're sharing leadership now. Everybody's like, I don't know what that means, and it makes me anxious. So I'm going to wait and see what other people do, and then I'll do that. And then the norms get created that way. Mm-hmm. And we end up right where we were before. So that's probably, Jerry, probably a great thing to bring up and say, let's talk about that a little bit, because that's a higher level of group function that's really kind of difficult to pull off.
Well, and where so many groups, I think, just jump right to, and these groups can get there. Well, what's our first policy we're going to review? Because that's why we're coming together. But especially for groups that are coming together for an extended period of time, which this group will be. I don't care how small you are, how big you are. This is going to be together for a while. I'd say it's probably going to be maybe meeting 3 where you're starting to say, okay, here's our first policy. Because I think having these conversations like we're having, so many teams, so many groups never have these conversations. But if you can't manage this process well, you're not going to manage any other process well. So I think in some ways this is a team. It's, if you think about an organization making transformation, this is the model also for that transformation. It's not doing necessarily just the work of addressing policies and procedures, which can be kind of monotonous at times, but if you're like me and a wonk, I get excited about it. But you're also sort of creating a culture which you hope also spreads and becomes a model for how the organization operates with each other. And so I think like these conversations about process, about how do we handle conflict? I just like our listeners to think, when in your organization is the last time you've had a discussion about how do we handle conflict in a healthy way? And if you haven't had that conversation in a while, likely you probably don't handle conflict in a way. So again, thinking about this group, not just as a group that's doing some concrete work, which they are, but really creating a model for how do people interact in a trauma-informed, trauma-responsive sort of way. And that sets a group up in a very different way instead of just a bunch of people showing up with a policy in front of them.
I bet that there is, and maybe there's enough people listening that this person exists among listeners of this episode, right? But I'll bet there is somebody out there who's a leader in an organization who's listening to us talk about process and how to talk about process. And either they're stressed out or like we all have this kind of a leadership aspect to us where like, I just want people to do their job.
Yeah.
Can I just have people do their job? Would that be okay? Why do we have to process everything? Okay, now I bet that person exists out there.
Not among us 3.
Today, but it may be me tomorrow. And those dilemmas just exist constantly, and they shift with how stressed we are or what pressure we're under. And so that's this kind of dichotomy that will start to, it will exist in a team. There will be people who are like, I just want to review the policy. I just want to get the task done. Mm-hmm. And that person may be the person on Wednesday, the next day, that's like, can we talk a little bit? Like, could we process a little bit? And those are dynamic tensions that play out in groups pretty consistently. And that's an interesting part of shared leadership, right? It's one of the reasons why it's so difficult. Yeah. Is that we have tendencies that we lean towards, like some people are more task oriented than others in general. And then we shift that based on our current state. Sometimes we're more task oriented than we are when we're stressed. Sometimes we get disorganized when we get under stress, when we want to go away from task orientation. So it's quite a complicated process to manage a group. There's not really,
I think that certainly we've had that conversation, right? On what day is like, I don't want to go in there and do this anymore, to kind of look at that piece, right? But I also think sometimes it's okay to be really clear and say, we need to have this decision by the end of this meeting. And so the dynamics change and say, you know what, we're going to discuss this for a short amount of time, and then we've got to move to a decision-making process, right? That as a leader, as long as you're really transparent about that, and there's a reason you're disbanding this normal process. For example, if the state came in and said, you need to have this in place, and if not, there's going to be a consequence to your organization, you've got to be really clear. We're going to get together. This meeting is about making this decision. I need your input. We'll do it, but we've got to have a decision by the end. Your role changes, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that, as opposed to just going in there and changing it and then tomorrow coming back and saying, okay, now we're back to this without any discussion of why this changed. Mm-hmm. So there are times, Curt, as a leader, I think you have to, in some ways, move to that different relationship and be very transparent about why that is. Or, you know what, something's going on and it's about a personnel issue and I can't share that with you. Right? Now the group understands what's happening. But oftentimes these things there's a few people who know that, and there's a lot of people who feel it, but nobody ever says anything. Yeah. And then that gets kind of, so I think really, as if leaders are listening, is really just being open about, here's what I need to do today and why I'm doing that. And tomorrow, if I come back and you have feelings about it, we could talk about it, but we need to get this done today.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Even thinking about how much time do you have to make the decision? That's a great first question. Do I have time for this, or can I wait? And that's a really good question to start with.
Well, and a lot of my thinking again, and I've kind of gone back to some of the research I did a couple years ago when I was creating this online training for a group is, do you have a decision-making process? How do we make decisions? Because, do we make it by majority? Do we shoot for consensus? Does the leader, the most highest ranked person make the decision? So, how do we make it? And do we need to get everybody on board in order for a decision to move forward? I kind of like, and I've always, because it's so simple, like a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or a thumbs sideways process. And this is really simple, where a thumbs up means I absolutely support this decision. Thumbs sideways is I may not necessarily, this might not be the decision I make, but when I walk out these doors, I'm going to support implementation. I can like handle my little bit. And thumbs down, at least in a consensus model, stops the process. And while you would think this would slow everything down, because a simple majority seems like, hey, that's going to speed the process up. But when you look at how they study these consensus models afterwards and the implementation of the decision, when you do reach a consensus, even if there's people that are kind of thumb sideways, the implementation is much more effective and efficient. So even though the discussion of it might take a little bit longer, it actually is more efficient. And yet, just think about the teams that you go to as our listeners, and I think even us. Do you have a decision-making process? And if your team's not together to make decisions around stuff, why is your team meeting? And you may have a good answer to that, but I think to really do some of this groundwork, and I think this is a great way to kind of go through if you look at that old model of team development, what is it? It's adjourning or forming is that first stage. This is a great way to help form the group and get you to the norming stage, because you've decided how to handle conflict. You've decided how to make decisions. You've had these discussions. And so you have some context to fall back on when you do kind of hit roadblocks or you hit difficult decisions.
So combining what you both said, the way you make decisions sometimes has a lot to do with how much time you have to process it, right? Mm-hmm. Because what I have found sometimes, Matt, when I have a lot of time to do it, is the group kind of gets convinced that this is the right decision or this is the right decision. Yeah. And sometimes when we have a lot of time is to put all those decisions up on the board and say I want you guys to sit with this to figure out, is there a different decision that we haven't even talked about yet that might incorporate this, right? Is maybe sit here, maybe go for a walk and come back. But when we have time is ask the group. That's one of the problems with brainstorming. When you brainstorm, you put all the things and then you prioritize, as opposed to saying, let's really look and be mindfully look at all these things. And is there something that emerges that we haven't talked about yet? But that's a lot of time to that, right? But if you have to make a decision by the end of the meeting, you have to somehow do this, but say we can have this discussion, but at some point we have to make a decision.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, how do I get you from here to there? I mean, so it doesn't have to be we all here, but how, and then usually those are little things for most people, though.
Right, but I'm saying well, trauma is going to push us sometimes to feel like we're pressured to act quicker than we really need to. So I think it's well worth it to really sit and say we feel like we have to there's an urgency to this decision, but what's the reality of that? Do we have one meeting? Do we have two meetings? So in really defining if this is a really important decision, maybe we have some time really to really sit with this and play with it and get input from other people and kind of manage that. And there are times, but the pressure that we're going to feel is trauma organized sometimes.
Well, that got really I served on a jury, and it was a jury in a county that I don't live in now. So I feel okay. I can talk about the process, but it was front page news, and it was the longest misdemeanor trial in Boulder County history.
Is that because you were on the jury?
Yeah, right. I was on the jury, yes. with the business and with the training coming up that I do. And somebody died in a traffic situation. And I walked into the jury room, and unfortunately, when you have an MBA, people want you to be in charge of the process. And it was a really traumatic trial. I mean, the county, which I thought honestly did a terrible job in the prosecution, created a video of this guy's death from his point of view. And his wife's in the room, his family, and it was just crap in my opinion. But it was a really intense trial. I thought we would walk into the jury room and everybody would say, this guy's not guilty. That was my absolute assumption, is there's no way this guy's guilty. And so we went around, because this is what I see people do on TV. That's my only okay, what are y'all thinking? And I was like, we're going to be done in 5 minutes. And there was one person who said guilty. And I give that person a ton of courage, because it was kind of at the last. And we sat with it for 4 hours, and we couldn't make a decision. And we went to the judge and said, just let us go home. And the judge said, you're coming back tomorrow. And I was like, oh, and we came back, and eventually everybody else went to that guilty verdict. And there was a lot of things in stake, but it just showed me, if you're given enough time, even under the most intense situations, and we formed and stormed and normed as a group, and some I thought was going to be a 5-minute decision, because we couldn't, if we came to a hung jury, there was huge consequences in that. So I just think the takeaway from this, think about your norms. Think about how you handle conflict. Think about how you make decisions, whether you've got a team that's been meeting for the last 20 years. Also, I suggest, if you've got a team meeting for the last 20 years, think about the purpose and why you're meeting too, because sometimes you just meet at 3 o'clock on Wednesdays because you always meet at 3 o'clock on Wednesday.
Right. So one of the things I think is important is that you don't want this team to go to burnout.
Yes.
So where are the quick successes in terms of reviewing policies and reviewing that we can get? And then where are these things that we need to really have some discussion to kind of look at that? because I think if you get in there and every one of these things that you do and you never get anything accomplished, the group is going to start to get frustrated.
Yeah.
So there are some things that we can kind of get through, and maybe, you have this pile of, these are things that, we clearly feel like we need to start doing this and it has to be done really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
These are the things we clearly think we need to stop. And the group gets to some agreement with this. And these are the things we need to spend some time really talking about and looking about it. So the group has in some ways, feeling of success and sense of the organization is changing and moving. But also this process is that there are things we have that shouldn't be made decisions really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes we will make decisions, and then the feedback we get from the people that have to actually kind of look at that is we have to be open and flexible to kind of looking at some of these kinds of things. So as a group, really trying to, what is our process for sorting through some of these things? So we keep moving.
Well, and that's kind of why I like that stop, start, continue, change, is that because the other thing this group has to handle, and this, we're running out of time, so we can make this a third episode, which is really great for me. The other thing is, how do we keep the whole organization with us in this process? Because we're going to be changing. We haven't even talked about, this group's going to come out with suggestions and changes that are going to challenge maybe long-held approaches, and we haven't even talked about the change process that comes out of this. So we're not going to cover that in a minute. So let's hold that off. But I think that's a great thing to kind of tie these two episodes together, is making sure you get a starting point that's at least important to everybody. And then, finding those things, and I'm all about, Jerry, as you said, that low-hanging fruit in some way. What's urgent, and that we can kind of come in, like, what was the number one stop thing coming out of this assessment? Because that might be one of the more easy ones to address, or it might be the start thing, but trying to find those easy wins both for this team and for the larger organizational program, again, builds that momentum. And just like we want with our clients, finding those little successes along the way and making sure as a team, because too many teams don't do this, celebrate the wins along the way. So we'll talk about implementation next time. And also, we got to talk about measurement too. How do we know we're successful? Because I think if we don't ask that question along the way, we can often lose focus as well. So stay tuned next week for part 3 of this trauma-informed transformational series of this, I think, really important concept that I don't want to rush it. So, Curt, Jerry, I want to thank you to our listeners. I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. And we'll see you next week for part 3 of our series. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.